Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
This is Mike,
I'm George.
and we are with Our Urban Farms, and we're really excited to be offering to you our kind of spur of the moment makeshift sourdough bread baking class.
These are strange times, so you got to get creative.
We have decided that in this unusual time, we wanted to do everything we could to work and connect out to our community the best that we could. And one of the things that we love doing is sharing our sourdough bread with people. And we thought, what better way to share sourdough bread than to encourage other people to be baking sourdough bread as well. Um, so here we are. We've got more and more people still showing up. So we're going to take just a handful of minutes to let everybody get settled in, make sure your audio is working, because we have a very full class if everybody shows up. We're going to generally keep everybody's audio muted because most of us, including I'm sure you're going to hear, we can have a noisy house because we have dogs and things here. So I guarantee you're going to hear some interruptions from our pets, and to have 30 people's pets barking wouldn't work out that great. So we're going to keep most of you muted during the process. After each session, we'll open things up for questions, and you can just literally raise your hands. If you've got a question, we'll unmute you, and we can interact. We also are hoping that you'll have your videos turned on, because as we're making the dough, as you're going to see, one of the most important parts of this is the actual texture, the feel, and the consistency of the dough. No matter how many recipes you read on the internet, none of them can really answer your questions until you see and feel the dough. And so if you turn your cameras on so we can see your dough as you're feeling it, we'll have a better sense of what's going on with your bread.
Mhm. Yeah, I just wanted to add, neither of us are professional actors. You probably are far closer than I am. She actually had a radio show. But we'll do the best we can to entertain you and make it as interesting as possible. Also, this is not the Culinary Institute. It actually is our kitchen. And so, it's a little bit more informal than like a formal, training at a culinary institute would be. But hopefully that will make it more like your world as well. So, and then also, it, basically, it's kind of how we do it on a Sunday morning. So it kind of unfolds the way we do it every Sunday morning. And so hopefully we can guide you through all of the different steps.
In all the preparations for the class, we've set things up so assuming that you are likely going to be making, one sourdough round, one large sourdough round. We're going to be baking more than that because we we tend to bake a lot of bread, and so so we're going to be making multiple dough balls for different purposes. And so while we'll be talking to you about the sourdough round you're making, we'll also show you some of the other things that we're doing. We're also going to be making bagels today. We're also going to be making some buns today. And so that'll also give you an insight into all the other things you can do with sourdough. But of course, with sourdough, it's not just about bread. We'll get into this a little bit later too, but you can do pastas and all kinds of things with sourdough. And so anyway, with that, I say we just sort of dive in and get started with um, uh, before we get going, we should probably kind of cover what you should have done so far.
Yep, that makes sense.
Ideally, before you got here today, you should have either gotten a sourdough starter or made your own sourdough starter and then followed our instructions. Here, that this is our sourdough starter, which we keep in the refrigerator. And you can see, even though it's in the refrigerator, it's got lots of nice, beautiful bubbles on it. It's just a really lovely starter. And now that you're done with it, now that you've made your leaven, you can feed it, put it back in the refrigerator, and you should have, we've got a bunch of leavens over here stacked up because we're going to, again, do a bunch of bread. But you should have a leaven that looks something like this. And I'm going to hold this up to the camera. Hopefully you'll be able to see there's a lot of bubbles. It's much more liquidy than when we first made it. And when I take the lid off of it, there's just this huge aroma of yeast and bread. So you should have one of these, and the leaven should be in the bottom of the mixing bowl that you're going to use to mix your bread. You should have one of those. You'll need some measuring cups. We use typically 1 cup measuring cup and a 1/2 cup measuring cup. You should have some dechlorinated water. You should have some nice salt, because the only ingredients we're going to put in this bread are flour, water, and salt. That's pretty much it, but the water is dechlorinated. Then if you want to spice your bread with anything, you're going to want to use, have your spices handy. We put organically grown, homegrown organic rosemary in most of our breads, and we also use it as a topping on the crust, and we'll show you how that works. And then if you're going to do an egg wash with any other seasonings to help get the seasonings to stick to the outside of the crust, you may want to have an egg handy to do the egg wash. The egg wash is optional. We also have garlic on hand here because we put garlic in the egg wash that we put on the outside of our bread for flavoring. You can't do sourdough bread without garlic, sorry. That's just how I am. So, and then you're gonna need something to stir your dough with and some measuring spoons. One thing that was not on your list that you're gonna wanna have handy, so take a minute now, you're gonna want a plastic bag. Because as the dough is rising, you're going to want to put the rising dough in the proofing basket in a plastic bag. That's going to keep all the humidity and things together so that the dough doesn't dry out. And you're going to need a proofing basket. We use these professional Bratz proofing baskets, and really all it is a basket with a cloth that comes off. The cloth is heavily coated with flour on the inside so that you can set the dough in here. The dough won't stick to the cloth, and it does the rising in this basket. If you don't have a proofing basket, you can create a makeshift proofing basket by, when we first got started, we just used a colander like this, and we used like a very smooth hand towel that we lined the colander with. Anything like that that's going to let air breathe through, and then that you can line with this. You're going to see why you need to do this. When the dough is done rising, we're going to roll it out very gently, and then carefully take this cloth off the top of the bread. So you're going to definitely need some sort of proofing basket. And I think that's pretty much all you need to get started today. And then do you want to talk about how the day is going to go?
Sure. I need to grab my notes because I don't have it all memorized. What we're going to set out today is 3 primary segments. There is a 4th one that kind of captures everything at the end of the day. But because of the way the process works, there's a period where there's activity going on to prepare something or to let something rise or do something like that or bake. And then there's a whole period of time between that really is kind of a break. And so that's how the day is going to go. This first segment is really about getting your dough mixed and in the bowl and allowing it to sit for a period of time. So that's the first segment that we're going to go through. First of all, it is to take the leaven and prepare a dough. And that's pretty much how it works.
And then after we make the dough, we're going to let it sit. There's a period that they call the autolyse phase, which is when you first add the water to the flour, the grain doesn't fully absorb the water right away. It takes some time. So we're going to let that dough sit for a good 45 minutes to an hour while it's fully absorbing that water and getting silkier and smoother. Then we're going to come back, then we're going to add the salt and a little bit more water and start the kneading process. That's when we're going to add any of the spices into the dough. We're going to knead it and knead it to really build up the gluten strands. The gluten actually forms during that autolyse phase. And then when we knead it, we're going to be stretching and weaving the gluten, which is kind of an elastic thing we'll talk about more later. And we're going to knead that dough into a nice tight ball of dough. Then we'll set it up for proofing. It'll rise for several hours, and then we'll be offline during that process. We'll come back, do the baking, then we'll come back at the end of the day and see what everybody's bread looks like. So that's kind of how the day is going to go. 4 sessions, and we'll be offline in between. At the end of each session, we'll set a return time and the things that you should be doing in the interim. And in the end of the day, we should all have lovely bread.
That's the
goal.
goal. That's always the goal. And with sourdough, you know, there's a lot of variables that come into play, and so it's not always certain what the end result is going to be. The more you do this, the more consistent it seems to be, but it is, I would describe it more as an art than a science. There's all sorts of variables from the kitchen, the humidity where you are, you know, what the weather is like, what your ingredients are, what kind of flour you're using, your oven and the behavior of your oven. And so all of those things really come into play that changes the dynamics of this process. For example, earlier in the month, we were down in New Mexico, and we had very, very different results in a desert environment than we have here in Minnesota. And so you begin to discover some of those nuances and try to adjust your process to account for those variabilities. But it is a learning process. I remember the first time we did this, we were so excited. Our first loaf of bread came out, and it really, I would describe it as, you know, kind of looked like a brick. But we were really excited.
A very fragrant brick.
Yeah. But we ate it, and we were really excited that it turned out at all. But it is more of that kind of a learning process. And so there's definitely a patience involved.
I always laugh when you read the recipes online about sourdough. Many of them say similar things. They say you have to measure down to the exact gram to get it exactly right, and this is the recipe, and you have to knead it for this many minutes or that many minutes. And I'm going to tell you this: they are all lying. None of that is true, because as George said, everything about your specific environment is going to change the outcome. You know, which flour you use, what the temperature, humidity in your house is. And by the way, all of them will put a side note at the bottom and with an asterisk saying it will vary based on all these factors. And since they have no control over that, you know, trying to measure down to the specific gram of how much water or flour you're going to put in is really kind of pointless, which is why it all gets down to getting your hands in the dough, feeling the dough. And so that's why the video is so important, so you can actually get your hands in, see what the dough is like, and get a feel for it. And so with that, I say we should start mixing up some dough. George is going to take on mixing up the bread dough here. I'm going to take some other dough back here and start mixing up back here.
Sounds good. I guess.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
You bet.
Oh, hi. So I noticed in the email you sent, it said to make the leaven to do a 1/2 cup of bread flour and a 1/3 cup of water.
Yes.
When I just logged into Zoom, it resent like an instruction thing that said the opposite, a 1/2 cup of water and a 1/3 cup of bread flour. So which one's correct? I just want to make sure my leaven is right.
Yeah.
You know, and here's the thing. It's whichever you did, it's the correct one. He does the leaven, I don't. I apologize.
The larger amount is the flour, so the 1/2 cup would be the flour.
And
Okay.
if you did it wrong, here's the fun thing. As you see when we get to the kneading phase, if your dough is wetter or drier, we're gonna adjust at that point. And so that's why I say, you know, the exact detailed measuring at any point is kind of irrelevant, because what you want to be able to do is when you actually start to knead the dough, you're going to add flour or water to it until you have the consistency that you want. And so if there's a little bit of extra water or a little extra flour when you make that leaven, it doesn't matter. All you're doing is you're giving the yeast flour and water to eat and drink. That's what you're doing. And as long as you've got the materials in there for the yeast to eat and drink and thrive, it's all good. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. There are different philosophies in terms of hydration. When you start reading about sourdough, you'll hear a lot about 100% hydration sourdough. What that means is equal portions flour and water by weight. And that's, you know, the epitome, the ultimate, most challenging sourdough to make, because you end up with the super wet, sticky dough. It's really hard to handle, but you also end up with a lighter, fluffier bread in the end. But getting to that, you know, is very variable, and you can always adjust it once you're you know, kneading the bread. So we're going to be working at approximately about a 75% hydration dough. And again, the leaven can be any range of that, really.
Yep.
All right. So
okay,
we're gonna start.
We are going to start, and it seems appropriate for the times we're living in that the first thing is to wash our hands. So there's a lot of hand washing during this, and so that's the good news.
The other good news.
Or do you want us to watch and then do it after we're done?
You can wash your hands now or whenever. It might be a good idea for everybody to just take a quick break and wash your hands. You're going to find that we're going to have our hands in dough a lot today. So the good news is that when you're making sourdough bread, it's just natural to wash your hands all the time, all day long anyway. The other thing that's really good is when we get to the end of the day, you're going to see we cook the sourdough at 500 degrees. So any bacteria or anything that gets into your bread or on your bread is going to be killed really quickly, because we're literally going to bake at 500 degrees, which is why we tend to wear shorts and t-shirts, because the kitchen can get really hot.
It will get hot.
So,
which is a good thing on a cold day like today. Okay, well, let's get started. Some of the other things is the bread we're making, all of the stuff today is for home consumption. And so, you know, if you're making it for somebody else, you might have tongs, gloves, you know, all of those things that go into good food prep. But since we're baking for today, we're not going to be using those, but we are going to be washing our hands quite a bit. Starting with the end in mind, this is a dough I made probably about a half hour ago, and I'll kind of hold it up, but hopefully you can see it in there. It's starting to kind of get more of a dough consistency. You can kind of see Mike's got his hands in there. It's a fairly sticky dough, and that's kind of what we're aiming for with our dough prep. And so I'm going to move this over here. We put a towel on top of it, and let's get started with dough. So I have my leaven in the bowl, and I think Mike showed you this, but we've got some nice bubbles going on in there. It smells very bread-like, and so that's what you want. And what I've done to kind of speed the process up a bit is I have measured out in this bowl 4 cups of the flour. And so you want 4 cups of flour to go into this.
and again, I'm doing everything he's doing, but I'm doing it back here too. So.
And we we might be competing for utensils. Okay, so you've got your 4 cups of flour, and I usually start with mixing in the water first. It just seems like the mixing goes better if I start with the water. And so I want 2.5 cups of water going into here.
2.5, no, 1.5. 1.5 cups of water.
Oh, 1.5?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, 1.5 cups of water. Hopefully I didn't steer you in the wrong direction here too soon. So we have 1.5 cups of water and 4 cups of flour. And we're gonna just mix all of that in here. So the first thing I'm doing is kind of mixing the water in with the leaven. Kind of get things kind of even a little bit. And then I'm gonna put in my 4 cups of flour on top of that. And we'll just mix that in the bowl. And the description that I've always heard, you know, with the dough at this point is that it should look feathery. I'm gonna get all of the leaven in, kind of get the flour in, get it looking fairly consistent before we stick our hands in there. Now you can use an electric mixer. Some people prefer that. We've got one in the background. If you use a mixer, make sure that you have the, I don't know, bread making prongs to go onto the mixer, but then also make sure that your mixer has the power it needs for bread making. Because making bread is harder on the motor inside. And so if your mixer isn't able to do bread, you probably will burn out the motor. And so make sure that that's the case. Now I've mixed it up. We kind of have a feathery sort of texture in there. It might be hard to see with the camera, but that's what you're aiming for. And then at this point, I go in with my hands, clean hands, and just kind of finish the process. I kind of press it in, trying to get the flour up the sides, and you just kind of, you know, mix it around to get a consistent texture throughout the dough. You want all the flour mixed into it. And it takes a little bit of time, but it kind of goes together pretty nicely and starts to get more even as you're kind of mixing it together in the bowl.
A lot of the online recipes describe it at this point before it's had a chance to sit. They describe it as just kind of a shaggy dough. And I think if as you're mixing the flour and the water together, you should experience some of that shagginess. It's not going to be even and smooth at this point until it goes through this first waiting period. And that's when the wheat flour is absorbing more and more of the water that's been added to it.
Yep. And there is a little bit more water, a 1/4 cup of water, or I'm sorry, a 1/2 cup of water that's going to be, what is it?
1/4 cup.
I'm sorry, 1/4 cup. I'm getting my forgetting my measurements here. A 1/4 cup of water is going to be added to this a little bit later because that 1/4 cup is going to allow us to dissolve a tablespoon of salt that gets added into this. And so your dough is, after that point, is going to get a little bit wetter feeling once you do that.
It's important to not add the salt now and let it go through this resting phase. A lot of people don't realize that flour actually doesn't have, wheat flour doesn't have any gluten in it. The gluten is now getting ready to form. The proteins that are in the flour, including glutamine and a couple of other proteins, form together at this stage. And when you add the water, the gluten starts to form. And the gluten is kind of like this rubbery, sticky substance. And the addition of salt now would hinder the development of that gluten. So we don't want to add the salt yet, or we'll end up with not really nice sticky gluten.
Can I ask a question?
You bet.
At this point is really sticky. It looks more sticky than yours. Is that okay?
Yeah, again, you're going to have some variability, and we have, even with the same batch, doing a couple of different bowls, we will have variability as well. And so that's okay, as long as you're working the dough, you can adjust for that, like Mike said, with adding just a little bit more flour later on in the process when it comes to kneading. So if there's variability of folks with how they're experiencing their dough, that's okay at this point.
Almost everybody that I've talked to or read from agrees it's easier to add flour later than it is to add water later. So if it's a little bit wetter to start, that'll help it absorb more water. It'll help it develop more gluten. And adding flour to that wetter dough will be a lot easier than adding water to firm dough.
Yeah, definitely easier to work with. So I'll kind of show it at this point. That's where my dough is. It's sticky, but that's kind of how it should be. Something that's kind of along those lines. Again, if you've got the stickiness, that's okay. The one I did earlier, it was far stickier than this one. And, you know, they come from the same, water source. We've got 3 starters. One of them is our, quote, New Mexico starter that we brought back from the desert. And so there is some variability that can happen between the dough balls just based on, you know, which starter jar you're coming from, because they are different.
Can you overwork the dough at this point?
Overwork it? Yeah, probably not. When it gets to the kneading, you can, but at this point, you don't have to work it very much, because really you're just trying to get the water and the flour mixed together so that they can begin, you know, the flour can begin absorbing the water. That's all you really need. When we come back, we're going to do a thorough kneading. And at that point, yes, you can over knead, because if you over knead it, the strands of gluten start to come apart, and then you won't get a really nice rise out of your dough. So, but when we come back and get to the kneading process, we'll give you some tips or tricks to know when you've kneaded it just enough. So it seems like I love seeing everybody's hands in their dough. That is just fun. That is fun to watch.
Yeah.
Then once you've got your dough reasonably mixed together, all you need to do is take like a clean towel and cover the bowl and let it sit.
Yep. And I'm kind of looking at, you know, how the dough is looking. And Joan, you were the one that asked the question. My first dough looked like what you're going through with it sticking to your hands, sticking to your fingers. That's okay. You will be able to account for that later on. If you're really concerned about it, you can sprinkle in a little bit of flour to give it a little bit more firmness at this point. But I would do it sparingly, because it's amazing how a little bit of flour will change the consistency quite a bit. and the stickiness is okay.
Very good. So our doughs are all set and set aside. So you're all going to cover your doughs and set them aside. We're going to meet back here online. We're going to go offline when the questions and stuff are all done. We're going to meet back here at 9:30. And by then, the dough should have changed quite a lot. It's going to be a very different dough when we come back at 9:30. And then we're going to start the kneading process. We're going to mix our spices and seasonings into the dough. We're going to set it up in our proofing baskets. We're also going to be showing how we set up our buns, because let me tell you, from my perspective, one of the best things that you can bake with sourdough bread are buns. You can freeze them, you can keep them on hand, and they're just wonderful to have. So we're going to show you buns as well. So we're going to set up buns. We're all going to collectively set up our sourdough rounds together when we come back. But until then, does anybody have any questions about what we did in this first round? Lisa, yes. Hi, Lisa.
Hi. So I don't know if you can see, do you see how my dough is like sticking to the edge and pulling away and it's really lumpy on top? That's okay?
That's okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
If you want to sprinkle just a little bit of extra flour in, you can.
I don't care. I just want to make sure it's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Again, we're gonna get to the nuanced detail of the texture when we do the kneading. It looks like your dough is on the wetter side, so you're probably going to want to add a little flour. If you were making 100% hydration sourdough, the really nice, good quality, difficult dough, that's exactly what the chefs are going to want to see. If you watch the videos of the experts, they have like a gooey mess and they'll have these dough scrapers, and it will literally be oozing around on the board. So it can be everything from kind of this tacky firm ball to a gooey mess and anything in between. That's one of the reasons I say, these people who say you have to measure it out to the gram, it's ridiculous. This is our dough. Look at
this was the first one that we did. Much wetter than the one I just did.
It's very wet and sticky.
So hydration is a lot higher on this one. I don't remember which starter I used with this. The New Mexico one seems to be wetter than the one we have from here.
When we get into it, there's another trick that's involved. When you have the really wet dough, the thing that gives it its structure in the end is the gluten. So as those rubbery gluten strands form, when you knead it and you weave it together, it's going to end up kind of having the consistency or the feel of a water balloon. So it should feel kind of wet, but we're going to try to make what feels a little bit like a water balloon with a tight skin texture on the outside. And how we form and shape that ball of dough will be part of the whole kneading and setting up for proofing process.
Yeah, the wetter the dough, the higher the hydration is. And the higher the hydration is, the more you're going to get that rise and the big holes inside of it. You get that airy kind of bread inside. The higher the hydration of your dough, the harder it is to work with it. And so, if we come back to the kneading phase and you need to add flour to your dough to make it a little bit easier to work with, then that's the point that you want to do that kind of adjustment. Again, we're shooting for somewhere around 70%. We've tried to get higher. I think we've gotten fairly close, maybe around 90%, but it is very challenging to get up to that 100% because the dough is so sticky, so runny, and it just takes, I think, a lot of experience to get a dough that you're comfortable working with that's that high in hydration.
So in other words, the wetter the dough, the better the bread really, but the more difficult it is to work with. So, and again, it's what's going to give the wetter dough the structure you need is the gluten. And so how you work the gluten, how you knead the gluten, and how you set it up is all going to be part of that process. So the drier doughs will be easier to work with. Even with the drier doughs, you're going to end up with a lovely, beautiful bread product. So if your dough is on the drier side, don't worry about it. You'll have an easier bread to make, and it will be lovely and delicious and wonderful. If it's wetter and you want to try the more challenging, go for it. And but you can adjust when we go to the kneading process.
Yeah, and the slightly drier can work better if you're making bagels or something like that. Bagels are probably the hardest thing, I think, to make. They're very, very temperamental as far as getting everything to go right in terms of the process. And so a slightly firmer dough seems to work better for the bagels than the bread and the rolls.
And in case people don't know, one of the thing that makes the drier dough important for bagels is bagels actually get boiled before they're baked. So you form the bagels, you let them rise and proof, and then you take those formed doughs after they've risen and proofed, you scrape them off the proofing tray, and then you boil them in water. And so that boiling process, if the dough is too wet, can make the result really kind of gooey and gunky and not great. And so we tend to make our bagel dough a little on the drier side.
And it's very variable depending on, all of the different things we mentioned earlier. For example, when we were in the desert in New Mexico, and usually when you throw the bagels into the boiling water, they float to the top. They actually sunk like rocks. And so we were really concerned because they were doing no rising at all. Then when we put them in the oven, that's where all the rising took place. So it was really shocking and surprising to us. We thought they were going to be a disaster. And we kept looking in the oven going, my God, these things are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So all the rising in New Mexico took place in the oven. So sometimes you have these unexpected results that come out of what seems to be a disaster in the making.
They really are like a work of art, like, a glazed pot. You never know what it's going to look like until you pull it out of the kiln. And that's true of sourdough bread too. There is not a chef in the world who knows what their loaf of bread is going to look like when they pull it out of the oven. We're going to do some things to decorate, but you never know what you're going to get. You can end up with a big flat flying saucer. You could end up with a big round puffy loaf. Because we're not adding any yeast. All the commercial breads out there in the market, we'll talk about this in the next session too a little bit, but nearly all the breads in the market, even those labeled sourdough, are not really sourdough. In order to get those big rises and those commercial looking big puffy loaves, they're adding yeast to them. And nearly all the yeast on the market is genetically modified. It actually kills the beneficial yeast and bacteria that's in your starter. It's not sourdough. And you can always tell, you can spot the fake sourdough. And by the way, the other thing they do to try to make it taste like sourdough is they add vinegar to the dough to give it a sourdough flavor, and then they call it sourdough. Well, it's not sourdough if they've added yeast and flavoring to it. Mm-hmm. A good sourdough bread, really the ingredients should be flour, water, salt, and any other seasonings. If it's got anything else in it, it's not sourdough.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, one other thing before we go, it looks like most everybody has finished their dough at this point, so that's good. We did have a question raised about gluten-free sourdough, and it is possible to make gluten-free sourdough. They make gluten-free bread flour to use. It seems like, we've never done it, but it seems like from the information online there's a lot of variability in terms of ingredients. The ingredient list is a lot longer with the gluten-free because you're adding things that mimic the kind of things that happen with gluten, which is critical to the process. And so if you are interested in that, you should look online. You're going to find a lot of different recipes that are out there. They have, people have different preferences for different ingredients. Some like gum added, some don't like gum added. Some like this flour use millet, and other people say don't ever use millet. The oil is different. Some people add eggs. Some people don't want eggs in there. The main thing that it seems like with the gluten-free is because you're trying to recreate the structure of the bread, which is the gluten. Instead of putting it in a proofing basket or something, you actually have to put it in the bread loaf tray to give it the structure and the shape that you want it. Otherwise, you're going to have this oozing pancake.
I have a little bit of a pet peeve about gluten-free sourdough, by the way, just because you know, we live, and we'll talk about this as we're kneading our dough because it's a fascinating topic. The reason people have so much problem with gluten is because of what we are doing with wheat, in the way we grow our wheat, the way we harvest our wheat, the way we add genetically modified wheat to everything, and the way we're not letting it digest. You know, what's happening now, as soon as we mix this flour together, that beneficial bacteria and yeast is actually starting to digest the wheat. And that makes it easier for us to digest. And so a lot of people who have issues with eating gluten have no problem at all eating sourdough bread that has a lot of gluten in it. It's not the gluten that they have a problem with, it's the Roundup and all the other chemicals that they're putting in our wheat. We'll talk again more about that. But so most people who can't eat gluten have no problem eating regular full gluten sourdough bread.
Yep.
And unless you're a celiac and cannot eat wheat at all,
Yep.
most people can eat sourdough bread just fine. So anyway, we're wrapping up this first segment. We'll be back here at 9:30. If you have questions, feel free to stick around. If you don't have any questions, we'll see you back here at 9:30, and we'll get into kneading the dough. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
And if you have questions, feel free to stick around, and we'll be around to answer them for you.
Hi, thanks so much for putting this on. This is so much fun.
It's fun for us too. We're having a
It's
blast.
fun.
So we'll see you at 9:30, or stick around for questions.
I just have one question.
Okay, sure.
My leaven had bubbles, but it didn't look as bubbly and robust as yours. And I'm afraid that last night I may have forgotten one of the two ingredients, water. Should I keep going? I made the dough. It looks okay.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you bet. There's going to be some yeast in there. After the kneading process, when we go into the proofing process, there's going to be a long time period, and we've structured this so that the time period can be a little bit variable for different people, depending upon how active their starter is.
Yeah.
And again, that proofing process is the long part when the yeast and the bacteria are doing most of their digestive work. And so if there's bubbles in it, you've got yeast and it's going to be doing its work. You just may want to let it proof longer. We'll give you some very clear tips on how you can know your dough is ready and the proofing is done. Yep. And how you can watch it. So absolutely stick with us. You can't screw it up.
and it's kind of strange because we're looking at you on our computer laptop, and I know the camera's up there, so don't think that we're not trying to talk to you directly, because it's kind of hard to go like this.
I just automatically look at you and you're over there, not up there.
No problem. Well, thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you back at 9:30. Any other questions?
Bye.
Bye. Bye. This is fun. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
First step done.
Yay.
Stay home, stay safe.